series of heavy hits in the past few months, and its economy seems set for another pummeling. The country depends heavily on oil exports, and prices, well, they are down sharply. The Russian currency is also losing value fast, and U.S. and European sanctions imposed after Russia's takeover of Crimea are biting hard. Take a look.
Russia and its president have been facing scrutiny from the West, big insiders being the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine. On top of that, the recent drop in oil prices have hit the Russian economy hard. The country is on the brink of a recession. As the value of the ruble is falling, inflation is expected. Putin's popularity is still sky high, and he has not faced any big protest over the economic decline. In his State of the Nation address, Putin accused Russia's enemies of seeking to carve it up and destroy its economy to punish it for becoming strong, but said his country would rise to any challenge. Yet, he produced no grand plan to pull the economy out of a crisis, aggravated by falling oil prices and Western sanctions over his policies toward Ukraine. Instead, he shifted blame for Russia's problems on the West, accusing enemies of yesterday of trying to bring a new Iron Curtain down around Russia. Russia's economy is not isolated within its borders, so its future, both economically and politically, will affect the West as well.
And we are back live now here on set at Fresh Outlook. I am joined by the Ebru think tank, Dan Friedheim, a former professor at Drexel University and a diplomat as well, Albert Goldson of Indo-Brazilian Associates, and Yohuru Williams, history professor at Fairfield University. Albert, I'm going to begin with you. Were you surprised by what Putin said during what amounts to his State of the Union address?
Absolutely not. This is basically typical Russian, comes out of the Russian playbook. Any sort of totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian regime which runs into any sort of difficulty, particularly economically, will certainly shift blame outside their borders, and the United States is always the favorite target for them.
But with the economic indicators so bleak for the coming year, that's the part I found surprising. It seems as though the sanctions are actually hurting Russia after all.
Actually, it's a combination. Not only the sanctions, and one of the key aspects of the sanctions is that Russia does not have access to the global international banking system, which is critical for financing. And that's one of the critical aspects. Although we've targeted a couple of oligarchs as to send a particular message, it's really shutting down their access to capital outside of Russia that's really taking a hard bite, in combination with the free fall of oil prices.
And Dan Friedheim, I'm going to turn to you on that. Why are we seeing falling oil prices, and how does it hurt Russia exactly?
Well, the prices of oil are not falling because of this conflict. Right. It's a completely separate, bigger dynamic. It even, I think a lot of people argue, has a lot to do with the success of U.S. fracking, producing a lot more oil, and Saudis deciding they don't want to lose share and not keeping the price of oil too high, and therefore ending up with less share. So it's really kind of lucky that that lowering price is squeezing Putin too. Right, so there are the sanctions by the EU and the US, and then reinforced, I would say, finally taking a bite because of the coincidence of oil prices falling too.
Yohuru, I was a critic of President Obama for not hitting Russia hard enough over Crimea and not allowing enough fracking on public land in this country. But let's give the devil his due. It seems as though those sanctions, although were put in place rather coolly, have been effective, and that fracking perhaps on public land wasn't needed because we seem to have an abundance of oil right now. Give me your thoughts on those issues.
Very true, and oil prices are falling here at home, and gas prices are falling here at home, so the American people aren't feeling this in the same sense. I think what's interesting about Obama's policy is clearly with his concerns in the Middle East, he didn't want to escalate the problems with Russia in that way. And so he chose these sanctions as kind of the least or lesser of evils. And I think, as Dan indicated, it just happened to work out in this particular instance. I think there are a lot of people who still believe that the United States should have taken a much stronger track on Russia at that time. Putin, at the same time, is not doing himself any favors in invoking this notion of a new Cold War and talking about an Iron Curtain descending, again, because the United States has been, most people would agree, very restrained in the way that we've dealt with this situation.
But Albert, demagogues get their power by creating an enemy. And Putin has seen a lot of success in his popularity ratings by isolating America, by pointing to them as being a major enemy of the Russian state. He's scoring points at home, right?
Yes, on one hand, he is scoring points at home because it's a comfort to the Russians that, gee, we're suffering here at home economically. The ruble is depreciating quite rapidly. In that sense, temporarily, that's good. But at the same time, he has internal enemies, and specifically the urban middle class. They were able to, because of the high price of oil earlier in the decade, to be able to become actually, quote unquote, European. It's a very professional class that they are very well paid. But there is a disconnect between that class and Putin. Putin continually talks about his earlier accomplishments. The urban middle class really wants to find out, what are you doing today and going forward? Also, at the same time, the urban middle class is upset with Putin simply because, due to their economic success, he is not respecting their desires politically for greater free speech. So that's one component that Putin is really going to have to be aware of. Otherwise, that can turn into a radicalization of the middle class, and that's exactly what Putin wants to avoid.
So we have this middle class as an enemy of Putin. Who else is Russia and Putin's enemies?
Well, certainly the United States, certainly Europe. Putin is really making enemies. He's a natural bully. He is the strong man, which, of course, as far as public relations are concerned, looks fantastic. He's actually almost evoking the czar, a czar-type persona.
Yeah, very much.
From the past, a kind of a communist strongman or czar.
Posing
and in that sense, and you can't really do that in a in a global society of today. It's just bad public relations. So unfortunately, it's like a snowball effect, and it's going to be very difficult to turn back on that, because he runs into the issue of trying to save face if you're trying to come up with a compromise, and that's very difficult for dictator like Putin to do.
Exactly. Dan, go ahead.
So he's invoking some specific moments in Russian history. Some of them maybe even almost mystical or even mythical. The nearest real history he's invoking is by annexing Crimea. He's saying Catherine the Great, the Tsar, took that land, so obviously it belongs to Russia. That's specifically an imperial claim. Right?
Exactly. Turning more our focus to modern times, we're seeing two major projects being canceled under the Putin regime as well, such as the cancellation of the South Stream pipeline, as well as a major railroad line connecting the East. What are your thoughts about these projects being canned?
Well, they're the first concrete costs that they're dreams. Someone was joking, it's a pipeline he has a dream about. It's a pipe dream. He's not going to be able to build that alternative to circumvent Ukraine and the problem of Ukraine when he tries to send gas to Europe, occasionally blocking that gas. He's not going to have that alternative. He's still dependent on sending gas to Western Europe through Ukraine. That's a failure. Now, another big dream he came up with immediately after the sanctions started to bite was signing an incredible mega deal with China. He's going to have to build some other pipelines to make that work, to actually make China an alternative market. And he's now talking about, if he can't do this existing pipeline that would have entered Europe through Bulgaria, maybe he can go through Turkey instead. We'll see if Turkey ends up helping him do that. But right now, he's a little bit constrained. And he can't afford, he was depending on the West to finance those pipe dreams, and he can't do that anymore.
Yohuru, we saw Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State with a huge reset button, laughingly. I'm sure it's going to be used in the 2016 presidential campaign against her. How we're going to reset our relationship with Russia. We were going to be friends after all. We also saw President Obama say, tell Vladimir when I'm president again, I'll be able to have more flexibility. What went wrong with the American and Russian relationship that it went so far south from where it was just a couple of years ago?
Putin. The strong man. I mean, I think Dan makes a really great point about history and about narrative. And Putin, in some sense, has been masterful politically because he's been able to shape the narrative in a way that speaks to the very deep roots of Russian history and to evoke things that are going to be meaningful to the Russian people. They don't play well on the international stage. For Americans
but
looking
at home, Yohuru, his popularity is twice as high as Obama's.
Until the people start feeling
right.
it. And so people start getting poor, and so people start losing their apartments, and people start going hungry, people start losing their jobs. Then it all matters what's in your pocketbook.
And that's why I think Dan's point is so powerful. I think that he's been able to do that masterfully there. When the narrative catches up, or when the reality catches up to the narrative, and the price, the price tag is there, then there's going to be an issue. Here in the United States, I don't think anybody who's being objective would blame the Obama administration for pursuing that, because at the time, Russia seemed the lesser of evils, considering our concerns in the Middle East. Now you look back, and I think Hillary Clinton is going to be very want to try to explain those moments.
She's going to have a few videos that'll surface, don't worry. That's just one of them. Tell me a little bit about why the currency is falling and why it seems like most of the world is pulling out of the economic recession right now, and Russia is just getting into the heart of it.
Russia is overstretched. Number one, going back to the sanctions, again, because they don't have access to international capital markets, it's very difficult to finance their debt. Already they have, I believe, $365 billion as far as capital debt is concerned for corporate debt that they have to pay the West over a period of time. They're unable to do that.
Could they just default on that debt and basically flip their hand at the West?
Putin doesn't want to go back to the late 1990s when they ran into a severe financial crisis, and the only reason why they were able to pull out of it was because commodity prices went through the roof. He was able to get out of that with oil primarily. Through that, he was able to build up a foreign reserve of about $400 billion, and that was specifically set, along with Alexei Grudin, his finance minister, to absorb any future economic shocks. They're running through a shock right now, but it's probably not going to be short term, and that piggy bank is being depleted very rapidly. So he's going to be between a rock and a hard place unless something turns around very, very quickly.
Well, you got 1.5 billion people in China that he'd like to do business with. That might be a helpful resource, like you said, Dan.
In the long run, perhaps they could replace the European market that he's still very dependent on. Now, the interesting thing for a political scientist like me is the economics are not stopping his intervention in eastern Ukraine. They're not rolling back the annexation of Crimea. In fact, politically, you could imagine they might be like cornering an animal that feels trapped, might actually lash out. And I'd be interested to hear if you think the economic price, the pressure, economic vice he's in, is going to close quickly enough before, for example, he grabs the land bridge that would be logical to add to his Crimea annexation, or when he talks in this narrative he's establishing, this imperialist narrative, it implies he has a right to all of southern Ukraine all the way to Moldova on the doorstep of the EU at Romania. I wonder if the economic pressure will work before he expands the political. Land grab is what it is.
Yohuru, do you think he's going to put on his T-shirt, stop flexing the muscles, play nice with America, and maybe say, okay, Hillary, bring back that reset button?
If history is any indication of what we know of Putin, I think what Dan suggests is the more likely scenario, that we'll see him act out in a way that will be detrimental to Russia as a whole, but certainly will continue, his policies and the way that he sees himself in relation to the rest of the world. It's really about him more than it is about the state itself.
Just a couple of seconds left. Albert, what's your final thought on the subject?
Well, the West has to be very, very careful not to push Putin so much in a corner that, as Dan says, that it lashes out. And we don't know to what extent Putin will lash out. He has a big ego, but it's a fragile ego. And he could be a very dangerous individual if he is put in a corner so that there is no escape route. He has to be able to save face. So it's a very delicate balance how we go forward with this.
All right, Albert, thank you very much. Guys, thanks very much for your thoughts. When we come back, the countdown is on. It's the holiday season. We look at whether Cyber Monday and Black Friday sizzled or fizzled this year. After this.